the comparison to the pre-9/11 Al-Qaeda is an obvious one, and yet a very misleading one, because Al-Qaeda, as also can be said about Afghanistan and the Taliban, are in a very different shape, organizationally, strategically, very different situation right now compared to 20 years ago. What hasn't changed too much, or at least not publicly, is the relationship between Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. And the Taliban, unlike some other statements, has never actually cut ties with Al-Qaeda. It has sought to distance itself from Al-Qaeda more publicly, but never made any kind of formal statement renouncing Osama bin Laden's group and the earlier relationship it had with that organization. So we know for a fact that they have continued the relationship, and also that there is a somewhat significant Al-Qaeda presence in Afghanistan. A UN report published earlier this year claimed that we have between a dozen and 500, which is actually a very, obviously a very large number, in 15 out of Afghanistan's 34 provinces. So that's like roughly, a somewhat serious presence of Al-Qaeda members in half of the country. So we have that to factor in, but also, I think it would be more relevant to look at the dynamic between Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, and ISIS-K, the Afghan branch of ISIS, of Islamic State, to understand where things might be headed in the next 6 to 12 months.
Yes, what about the ISIS-K branch here? We've seen them sort of raise their head already, some 13, I believe, U.S. service men and women killed by them in that evacuation, suicide bombing that took place at the airport there. What do we know about ISIS and what kind of threat they pose, even as a rival to the Taliban?
Well, that's maybe the most pressing question facing any kind of counterterrorism or jihadism analyst since the announcement of U.S. withdrawal, certainly since we've seen the start of the actual evacuations of the U.S. presence in the country back in August. Well, Al-Qaeda has been more shy, in a sense, before that evacuation was complete, but ISIS was very much firm to stay on top of events and to actually dictate the pace of events, including by perpetrating that terrorist attacks at the Kabul airport, which was, the deadliest terror attack in Afghanistan's history in a very long time. And since then, both in its public statements, its video releases, and its kind of commentary on events in Afghanistan, then ISIS has been very happy to portray the Taliban as basically a U.S. ally, as collaborators, and instead of some kind of victory for the Mujahideen, which has been Al-Qaeda's take on the U.S. withdrawal, instead it basically claimed that the United States was handing over power from the legitimate Afghan government, which existed before that, to the Taliban, essentially portraying the Taliban as a U.S. client state, and yet as yet a new U.S. client state in Afghanistan, in Kabul, instead of being some kind of more formal jihadi action.
I want to get your thoughts here in less than a minute, but along those lines, what can we tell of how the U.S. is looking to manage this new reality in Afghanistan?
Well, I think that for the U.S. it became clear, especially since the actual evacuation, that some kind of a form of cooperation, even tactical cooperation with the Taliban is, problematic for all of the obvious reasons, and yet inevitable. It would not have been able to complete the evacuation from the Kabul airport, both of U.S., British, and other NATO forces from the country without the kind of tacit cooperation with the Taliban. We have many accounts, including also reported by the international media, of Taliban members, armed Taliban members, standing guard in the airport, preventing the mass flight of Afghan refugees and not allowing basically the U.S. to complete its withdrawal pretty much on schedule.
On-the-ground collaboration, yes, it was. Yeah, caught the attention of the world, certainly seeing the evacuation among so many other things taking place in that short period of time. Adam Hoffman, thanks for being with us here to take a look at the latest.